Hi students, this is Mr. Eckert. We're going to go through target E4, which says you should be able to explain the concepts or ideas of gene flow, speciation, mutation, genetic drift, and something called sexual selection as it applies to evolution using real-world examples. So we've talked a little bit about natural selection versus artificial selection already. Remember, a similarity between the two is they both involve something that's selecting for a particular trait. And in both of those, the traits are going to give the organism a particular advantage in the situation that they're in. But remember, the main difference is in natural selection, it's nature or the environment that's doing the selecting, whereas in artificial selection, it's human beings that are selecting for particular traits. We talked about several examples of artificial selection. We used the examples of dogs and all the varieties of dogs, and remember those all came about due to artificial selection, individual humans deciding that they wanted a dog looking a particular way, and then they were bred to look that way. And of course, you could use lots of different examples from livestock as well. Horses, the variation in horses, cattle, chickens, those are all good examples of artificial selection. There's thousands of examples of natural selection that you can think of. Here's one that involves beetles, and of course, if you have a population of beetles that's living in a rainforest where it's very shaded all the time, you would expect beetles that have a darker coloration are going to blend in better and be more camouflaged from predators, and therefore they would have an advantage, and they would not be eaten as much, and so you would expect them to maybe increase in their population. Gene flow is simply any movement of genes from one population to another. That would be the definition of gene flow. How does that come about? Well, it could come about through migration of animals. Maybe you have birds that are migrating from one area to another, and then they introduce new genes into a population that did not exist there before by mating with individuals of that new population. It could be some kind of geographical isolation that existed before that is now removed, and it allows two populations to intermix, or it could be something simple as in the example here of pollen being blown to a new destination by wind, or people moving to a new location. So a key thing though is that if the genes that are migrating did not previously exist in the new population, then that will be an important source of genetic variation. So here's an example of two populations of beetles. Let's say there was some kind of geographic barrier here that was removed, and now the two beetle populations are allowed to intermix and mate with each other, and so that would represent gene flow. Variation versus adaptation. Variations, remember, are simply differences in individuals in a population. So in a population of penguins, as you see in the picture, if we took measurements, you would expect there to be differences in the amount of fat or blubber that all the individual penguins would have. However, an adaptation always gives the organism an advantage, and that's the key difference. So in order to be an adaptation, it has to give the organism an advantage, although you can definitely have variations that aren't adaptations. In fact, some variations may not give the organism an advantage at all. It may be a detriment or a negative effect on that organism. So just keep that in mind, that adaptations always have to give the organism a leg up on others in its environment. So a penguin in this scenario that had a little bit more blubber, of course, you would call that an adaptation because it would be able to survive better in the cold climate that it lives in. Within an organism, remember, the variations can't change because those are determined by the organism's DNA. So the organism can't change its DNA. Those variations are going to stay with that organism until it dies. However, within a population, you can definitely have new variations that occur because of mutation or simple simply because of sexual reproduction, that can introduce new variations. Adaptations within one organism can occur if there's a change in the environment. So what was previously a neutral trait, or perhaps even a negative trait, might, due to a change in the environment, now become an adaptation and an advantage. For example, if you have a population of grasshoppers living in a lush green prairie, and there's a few brown colored grasshoppers living there, maybe because of mutations. Let's say there's now a change in the environment, and there's a severe drought that lasts for several years, and you have a lot of plants that die off in that prairie, and now it turns brown. Of course, the green coloration is not going to be an adaptation anymore. Those are going to stick out. Now the brown grasshoppers are going to blend in better, and that's now suddenly an adaptation. So in this example, it may remind you very much of the peppered moth simulation that we did in class. Speciation is simply when a new species arises. So that can happen because of some event or some kind of, like for example, maybe a hurricane blows a population or several birds from one island to another, and now they're isolated from the original population, and then they can start changing as they reproduce. Or it could be a geographical isolation, like the example that we used in class of the Grand Canyon and the squirrels that live around the Grand Canyon. So before the Grand Canyon formed, we talked about how the Colorado River, scientists believe, as it started to erode the canyon away and start cutting into the rock substrate, this population of squirrels became separated into a population that lived on the north rim and a population that lived on the south rim. And as the canyon deepened, they were no longer able to even interact with each other and became not exactly two separate species, but what scientists believe are one is a subspecies of the other. So here you see the Kaibab squirrel, and they're actually found on the north rim of the canyon. You can see this satellite image here. It's actually inverted, so this is north and this is south. The A-bear squirrel lives on the south rim of the canyon. You can see the two squirrels look very, very similar, although there are differences in their coloration. And the Kaibab squirrel has larger ear tufts than the A-bear squirrel does. But again, they believe that these changes came about because of a geographic isolation that occurred. So that would be an example of speciation. So as they evolve separately from each other, you can see they become more different physically, just like the two squirrels had some physical differences, but more importantly, they become different genetically. So eventually, you can have two different species. So when do we consider them to be two different species? Because I said the A-bear squirrel is actually considered to be a subspecies. That occurs when one species branches off into two, and you can tell it's two different species because the two individual species produce fertile offspring. Then they're considered members of the same species. So, for example, a horse that mates with a donkey, will produce a mule. But the mule is sterile. The only way you get more mules is to mate another horse with another donkey. So that shows that those are two separate species. Donkeys can mate with donkeys, and they can produce fertile donkeys. So they are separate species from horses. However, Labrador Retriever dogs, if they mate with a poodle, they'll produce a Labradoodle, and those are fertile. So that shows that the Labrador and the poodle are both the same species. Sexual selection is a process by which organisms are selected for mating purposes. And therefore, any traits that they have, of course, are going to be passed on to the offspring. This is why some individuals may have traits that don't really give them an advantage in surviving in their environment. For example, if you think of their state bird, the cardinal, the males are bright red, which makes them stick out in their environment. Boy, they're a lot easier to see by predators, but that attracts females. So that would be an example of sexual selection. So, and that would be another example of female choice, because in this type of sexual selection, it's the females that are choosing males based on, as it says, either the way they look, it's colorful, or some kind of elaborate ornamentation like you might see feathers in birds, or a behavior that the male will do. In the other kind of sexual selection, there's competition between males, and of course, as they compete, the winning competitor then has access to mate with those females and pass on its genes. So, of course, you know a lot of examples of these. Anytime you see two antlered animals that are battling, like white-tailed deer or elk, or if you think of maybe elephant seals, and they'll battle on the beach, and the one that beats the other one will then have access to mate with the females and pass on its genes. Peacocks are a good example of this. The male peacock has bright feathers, and it uses those to attract peahens, the female peacocks. And of course, the one that does the best job of that and has the showiest feathers are the one that the female selects to mate with, and then they can pass on their genes to their offspring. But you can see that the tail itself doesn't really help the peacock survive in its environment. In fact, it's definitely a detriment to its survival. It's heavy. It makes it stand out more to predators. So this is an example of sexual selection. There's a good video that explains this more, that if you're watching this on your own, you should click here so that you can see this clip. It's about 8 minutes long, but that's sexual selection. Here's another example, a photograph you can see of the throat flap on a lizard, that this is a male lizard, and it would use this to attract a female for mating purposes. Select pressure is when one species puts pressure on another species and causes it to evolve or change over time. For example, if you have a population of zebras living with lions, of course, the fastest zebras are going to get away from the lions, and they'll mate and pass their genes on to their offspring. And so they're putting pressure on the lions to become faster as well. And the lions, of course, are going to, the fastest lions are going to catch the zebras, so you can see that they're also putting selective pressure on the zebra in the same way. Last is gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. Gradualism is the idea that species change very, very slowly over long periods of time. And if you did a graph of this, you would have a very gentle slope, maybe even more gentle than this, or gradual than this, something like this here. Whereas punctuated equilibrium, you may remember this idea was introduced by a scientist by the name of Stephen Gould, and his idea was that you would have rapid periods of evolution followed by little or no changes, and if you graph this, you're going to see here, these are the times of rapid evolution here, and then you might have a flattening out of the graph, or even a very slight incline where you'd have very little change. And it would be during these periods that the environment would not really be changing much. But during times where the environment is changing a lot, Stephen Gould believed that you would have the opportunity for some species to change rapidly and evolve rapidly. Now, of course, some might just die out, but he believed that this could occur, and there's evidence to show that it does indeed. Genetic drift is a change in the frequency of alleles in a population. So anytime you have a change, and this can be measured often as a percentage or a ratio, so whenever that changes, that's referred to as genetic drift.